Do you feel the urge to move toward a more play-based practice and just don't know how to do it? Or maybe you're struggling to incorporate more child-led learning into your otherwise teacher-led program. The research is clear. Play is how children learn best during the early childhood years. But creating a classroom where play is the focus isn't always as straightforward as it may seem. I'm your host, Jen Zollinger. Join me as we explore the incredible ways that play serves preschool children and how to best implement it in your classroom. This is Play Before Pencils. I'm excited to welcome Abby Bucher to the podcast today. Abby is a longtime early childhood educator from Indianapolis, Indiana. She has been studying the Reggio Emilia approach for over 20 years and has worked in Reggio-inspired schools during her time in the classroom. Abby has taught preschool, kindergarten, and first grade, as well as shared her support through the role of pedagogista. In June, Abby started her own business, Woven Thread, which is a company that is focused on pausing and connecting. Through her consulting, her before and after school club, Do Anything Club, and her monthly Park and Play group, she hopes to support educators, museums, children, and families with slowing down, connecting with people and nature, and developing a stronger understanding of how to lift all children up in our community. Abby, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm grateful that you were willing to come on and be on the podcast with me.
Oh, so excited to be here and just excited to share what I'm passionate about.
Great. So when I was in the planning stages months and months ago of creating this podcast, I put a question out to my social media followers, what kind of topics they were interested in hearing about. And I had so many requests for an episode on Reggio. So even though it's been around for a really long time, I think, at least for me in the area that I'm at, I'm sure regionally things are different, but it's an approach that I think is maybe a little bit lesser known. It's beginning to gain a lot more notoriety. And I know in my own area, there's a lot of Montessori schools and everybody's familiar with Montessori, but there's not very many that advertise themselves as Reggio inspired. And so since it's an approach that might be new or at least less understood by a lot of my listeners, would you mind just starting out by sharing just maybe a brief overview of the history of the Reggio Emilia approach and where it came from?
Yes. So it is out of, so the Reggio, there's a beautiful area in northern, kind of north central Italy, where Parma ham is from, where just a lot of beautiful things are from this region. And in Reggio, so Reggio Emilia is just a province or city, and it was bombed in World War II. And they had to rebuild it. And during that time, there were a lot of progressive educators and thinkers. And one of the educators was Loris Malaguzzi. And he just shared kind of his stance on how we look at children and how we honor children. And during that time, they had a vote on how they were going to rebuild, kind of where they were going to start rebuilding the city. And the men wanted to build a theater, and the women wanted to build a school. And the women won. And so there's this famous saying, brick by brick. The city, the school was built with the community at the foundation. And at that time, it just really showed the community that children are at the forefront of society. You know, they're not in the back, they're not lesser than, but they're just as important as all other ages within in the city. And so Loris Malaguzzi he was an educator, and he just kind of grew into this leadership position where he, alongside some other really progressive thinkers, took ideas from Piaget, took ideas from Montessori, and kind of melded into an approach that is very focused on the child and how people view children. And in the early 90s, there was an article that came out about kind of the most world-renowned educational philosophies or approaches. And for the early childhood kind of stage, Reggio Emilia was the top educational approach or philosophy. And so at that time, that early 90s, it really just blew up. And so since then, people from all over the world have wanted to see what it looks like in action. And so since then, they have visitors all the time that are coming to visit the schools to learn more about how they think and how they approach education. And they've been, a top early childhood approach in philosophy for decades now.
Yeah, I remember when I was in college in the late 90s, I was in a class where we were put into groups and assigned a philosophy of early education to study and create a presentation on. And the group that I was assigned was Reggio Emilia. And looking back, it's kind of funny, you're working on a group project, you don't have a ton of time to put it together, so you can't go super in depth. We really focused on the art aspect of Reggio. And so for many, many, many years, I just thought it was kind of an art-based early childhood philosophy. And there is an important, there is a lot of art with that, but there is so, so much more to Reggio. And
Yes.
it's really a beautiful, beautiful philosophy that I myself have embraced in my own classroom. And I'm excited for people to learn more about it and how they can bring in elements of that into their classroom because it is so focused on the child. And that's really what our goal is, to help and cultivate the child. So that's where our focus should be. So
Yes.
my first connection with you was last spring at the Utah Early Childhood Conference. And I remember there were a couple of girls sitting in front of me, and you were kind of mingling with the audience a little bit before you started. And one of them, talking to her friend, said something like, "Oh, so and so, I'm pretty sure that she's certified in Reggio." And and you said, "Well, actually." And so I would love for you to expound upon, because we're going to be using the term Reggio inspired throughout the discussion. And so I want people to
Yes.
understand what that means to be Reggio inspired versus you might hear that people
Yes.
who run a Montessori school are certified. So can you just kind of distinguish between them?
Yeah, so there's actually no certification in being a quote unquote Reggio teacher. That doesn't exist. Or the only place it exists is in Reggio Emilia. And so they're very clear. I've been privileged to go twice to Reggio Emilia, and, they're very clear on anywhere outside of Reggio Emilia that really dives deep into the work. They're inspired by Reggio. So, I've only taught in Reggio inspired settings during my career as an educator. And we have to be very, very careful and very clear to say we are Reggio inspired. And so, it's interesting because without the certification, or without there being a certification, there's a lot of interpretations of what it looks like to be Reggio inspired. So it's really interesting to see, well, what does it look like in this setting? And what does it look like in this setting? And, it's amazing to see what people take away when they've read and dug in, that a lot of times it's the way and approach to looking at children. It's what in Reggio, it's what they call the image of the child. And so in a lot of spaces, it's what you believe about children. I believe that all children are capable, competent, and creative. And so that is a lot of times the thread that kind of connects a lot of these spaces that are digging in. It's how we view children, but there is no certification for that.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I love about Reggio is, with Montessori, if you're really running a Montessori school the way it should be, it's pretty specific and strict, the types of materials and things that you use. I love with Reggio, it's more, there's room for flexibility, and even probably from year to year with the different students that you have, you might approach things just a little bit differently based on their needs. And so I love that flexibility. I love, sometimes I do see websites for programs that advertise themselves as Reggio inspired, and I think, wow, that looks so different than my program. What are our common threads here? Because we're both saying that, and
Yes.
there's just a lot to take from that, but there is that flexibility that's really great. You mentioned the view of the child and how important that is in this philosophy. And so what What does that mean to you? And what is the role of the child in the learning process in your classroom?
So within the classroom and just living in general, I can also put it as in the context of being a mother. And so I have two children as well. And so being a mom, being a teacher, it's, the image of the child helps me know that they're humans that have thoughts and beliefs and ideas that should be heard. And there are humans that have, while not the experience that I've been through, they've had their own experiences. They're not coming empty. They're coming full with so many experiences and questions and fears and adventures that help them with constructing the world around them and constructing that understanding. And so I think the role of the child is really vital, when we're early childhood educators, elementary, middle school, high school, college, museums, whatever, anywhere where there's children, they hold the story. They hold the kind of the light that then we continue to help foster, prosper, to make their flame brighter.
As you were talking about that, I was reflecting a little bit on my experience, the years that I taught in a more traditional setting that was very teacher
Mm-hmm.
directed. And
Mm-hmm.
that piece is so muddled in that kind of an environment because it's all about what I need the children to do and what information I need
Mm-hmm.
to convey to them over the course of the school day. It was an inconvenience when children experienced difficult emotions. And it really was so much more about the grown-up in the room than the children. And there were a lot
Mm-hmm.
of things that made that really hard then as a teacher. And as I have like stepped away from that space and embraced this more, very child-led and really viewing those children as complete and whole human beings. Would I want somebody to
Mm-hmm.
treat me the way that I had been treating some of those children in my classroom before? Certainly not. And
Mm-hmm.
so being able to
Mm-hmm.
shift your perspective and see them as that whole person makes such a difference in the way that you approach the way that you teach. It really is
Yeah.
life changing.
Yeah. And I think too, it's just as much as you looking at the role of the child, it's very much looking at the role of the teacher and
Yeah.
looking at the role of family and the role of environment. And I think in Reggio, they hold all of those things so close, and value each of those roles with such respect and such care that it's really, they're kind of on this journey together of filling each other up. That it's not I'm the teacher, I'm going to fill you up, but it's the children filling the teacher up just as much as the teacher's filling the children up, and just as much as the environment is filling the children up, and the families and the community. They're all working at kind of raising that like respect and human dignity to a higher place.
Yeah, it really is kind of a sacred experience to be able to
Mm-hmm.
go through that with the children. And we've touched on the child. Let's maybe explore the environment, the teacher, the family and community, and talk about what
Mm-hmm.
the roles of each of those are, because they are kind of, the child I think is at the core, and then those surround that so tightly.
Yeah.
Maybe we can go on the teacher route first, just with that reflection that I've had
Sure.
with my being a teacher in a more traditional view. And it was a big leap for me to go from somebody who was the deliverer of all of the information to kind of being a co-learner and bringing in a
Yes.
significant amount of observation and reflection. It was not the kind of teacher that I had been taught to be in college. And so it really was very different
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because kind of before I answer that, role of teacher, I went to Butler University. And during that time in Indianapolis, I had a lot of experience with professors who were also digging into Reggio inspired practice. And so I remember being a freshman in college And my professor at the time, Ina Shelley, she showed some slides from Reggio. And I knew at that moment, I raised my hand and I was like, when can I go? Like I am in love. This is it. And it's since then, it's kind of been my I don't want to say my life's work, but my passion as an educator to look at Reggio and see what does it look like in our American context. What can I take away? Because Italy and America are two very different
Yes.
places. And and I've been in public school settings. And so, well, what does that look like in a public school setting? And so I've really had such a I've had a lot of opportunity to be able to dig into this approach, while also I feel like I've scratched the surface. I feel like I could study
Yeah,
this for 50 more years
right.
and still uncover amazing thoughts and wonderings. So kind of turning into that, that role of teacher. I think the role of the teacher is to be an observer. I think the role of the teacher is to be a listener that hears, not a listener that's distracted, but a listener that truly is sitting in and with their entire body, they're hearing what the children are doing and saying and what's verbal and what's nonverbal. I think the role of the teacher is to respond to the inquiry kind of questions and wonderings that children have, in a way that I think of myself as a storyteller, as an educator. And so what stories are being created every day and what stories are being born and thought of and what stories die, what stories continue. So I really think of myself as a storyteller in a lot of ways to kind of co-create this story of life that we're on, when we're in school together. I think the role of the teacher is to love, is to love the children, not where they should be, but where they are, and who they are, as authentic as you can be, so that they feel seen and heard and valued for who they currently are right now.
Yeah.
And so I think it just is like there's a variety, but I think there's honor and respect. And it's scary teaching in this way sometimes because there's a lot more flexibility and responsiveness rather than I'm going to do this for a week and then I'm going to do this for a week and then I'm going to do this for a week. It's thinking like, what questions do the children have? And then how can I provide experiences for them to dig into those questions? And it's a little bit more on your toes,
Yeah.
but it feels so real and it feels so much more authentic in that living piece.
Yeah, I really can relate to that because when you are used to being a teacher who maybe works on, pre-decided themes for the whole year, you start in September and the whole year's planned out as far as what our theme's going to be, and you have a wealth of lesson plans to draw from. It's not that way in Reggio, and that can be a little bit overwhelming initially to work in that space of this happened today. What am I going to do about that tomorrow? and
Right.
and it can be a big change for people and a little bit scary to step into that, but you're right, it is so much more authentic. And for myself, I don't feel like it really took that long to kind of get into that flow because the children are
Yeah.
giving you so much information to work with. And so it's not like you're
Mm-hmm.
even, I mean, there may be scrambling as far as like what supplies do I need to add that I don't already have, or, some practical logistical things like that. But they're giving you so much information about what they're interested in, what they're ready to learn, how deep they want to learn about that. And so being able to just kind of flow with that I found it to be
Right.
actually quite freeing compared to
Yeah.
having pre-planned lessons that I had to draw from.
Yeah. And sometimes it's okay to have those pre-planned
Oh, yeah.
lessons.
Yeah. There's always a little bit of that.
Yeah. And I think sometimes though, are we looking for surface level understanding or depth of understanding? And
Yeah.
I think sometimes when we're tied to X, there's going to be a level of surface level understanding. And I think, we know as early childhood educators, birth through 5 are the most important years of a child's life. And so, for us, there's this kind of level of responsibility in a way to think about, I think that's why Montessori, there's so many places, because Montessori does a lot of like real world learning,
Yeah,
and in Reggio, they want that too. They want real world. The birds seem to be really thirsty. Well, let's create something to support the animals in our habitat, and then there's like
yeah,
they're constructing, they're negotiating, they're collaborating with the city, they're problem solving. And so there's these kind of crucial life skills that are being implemented, and so sometimes it can be a little scary to not know where it's headed.
for sure.
But when we're looking at process versus product, so many schools are product driven spaces. They need to get X by this date, or they're going to be behind if they don't. But man, that process piece, if we can slow down and pause and honor that moment of a child seeing something for the first time that they've never seen, or overcoming a fear that they haven't been able to express. There's nothing like it. And then the end is going to be so much bigger than what we thought if we can honor that process and go deeper.
Yeah, yeah, those perfectly curated lesson plans often restrict the actual learning
Mm-hmm.
that could take place when we allow the children to lead in that. So it's so true.
Yes.
Let's talk a little
Yes.
bit about the environment. I think when you go online and you look at pictures, hop onto Pinterest and say, what does a Reggio classroom look like? You're going to see a lot of aesthetic that looks similar, and aesthetic is important. It definitely,
Yes.
has an impact, but maybe we can talk about the importance of the types of materials that are in a classroom, what purpose they serve, what kinds of things we should be thinking about bringing into our classroom settings.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny to me, because when I think back to where I was when I first started, it was like, oh, to be Reggio, you need branches, you need stumps,
Yes, yes,
and there's this kind of thing that people grab onto, and they're like, okay, now we're Reggio.
yeah,
And what I've learned over time is there has to be purpose and intention behind the space that you're in. And so, one of the things I always kind of think about is like, if a space isn't being used, you shouldn't have the space, trade it out
yeah,
for something else if it's
yeah,
not being used. How is kind of real world, children want to be seen as real, authentic people. And so a lot of times we think of like, maybe pushing and having more glass, or like if you have a dramatic play area, maybe there's real plates and there's real cups as a way to honor and support their independence with being responsible with things that are going to be a part of life forever. High quality materials are so important.
yes,
In Reggio, you will see it's not about having everything. It's about choosing 4 or 5 things and then having really high quality materials for those 4 or 5 things. And, really digging into how you're using those materials. So they do a lot of teaching when it comes to using materials. They do a lot of just like one little step, then they explore, one little step, and then they explore. And so, it's kind of like less is more in a lot of ways. There, in terms of the walls, what's on our walls, if it's something that the children can't connect with. So, for example, if it's something bought at a teacher's store, they're not going to be able to connect with that. Rather than if they see, so let's go back to the dramatic play area. If they see a picture of themselves setting the table for a friend, they're going to see themselves as capable, as kind, as respectful to their community, because they see themselves in that photo. Mirrors are a huge thing that really offers children the opportunity to stop and look at themselves while they're engaging in play. Natural materials are another thing that's really important. And so, there's this kind of mixed kind of experience where inside the classroom, there might be loose parts that are natural materials, but then they go outside and they use the natural materials in a different way. And so to me, I feel like there's just high quality. If it's not being used, it's not in the room, offer enough that children can be able to experience independence and responsibility. So instead of you clean up at 4 o'clock when everybody's left, they all help clean up because it's part of their space. And then everybody says goodbye at the end. And so it's the shared responsibility of creating a space that's for children, that's in responsive to the things that they're curious about, that isn't set in stone.
Yeah, and I find that when you are providing children with things that are high quality, number one, this was a mistake that I made my first years. It was kind of like I had everything out. And why I made that mistake, I don't know, because I have my own children and I know that when there are too many things to choose from, it all just gets dumped and nothing gets used. Clearly,
Yeah.
I didn't bring that into my classroom space the first go round with this, but pulling back a little bit, like that less is more. And I also find that when children know that they're trusted to use the materials, they use them very appropriately. And,
Mm-hmm.
I think about the art supplies that we have in my classroom are all where in a previous school that I worked in, they were all up in the high cupboard. And if somebody needed some glue, they had to come to me and ask for the glue. And if I was in a position to get it, I could get it and, whatever. Now they're all down on the children's level. And we talk about the importance of the materials at the beginning of the year and the appropriate way to use them. We don't turn our glue sticks all the way out and then smash them hard. We go through all of those things and then they are trusted to use them. And
Yep.
do some things get ruined? Absolutely. That's part of the
Yep.
learning process. But just that ability to know that if I feel a drive to create something, the supplies to do that are here for me and I can use them. And my
Yes.
teacher trusts me to do that. And there's just that mutual respect is incredible to see in young children because we don't always give them credit for being able to do that.
Right. And I think it goes back to, in Reggio, they talk a lot about democratic participation. And, I think that when we look at a classroom space, wherever we are, and we think of it as our space, it creates more honor to everybody that walks in the space. And so, one of the things when I started working in the school that I've been working in for the last 13 years, we said, okay, we're going to start and we're not going to have teacher desks in any of the classrooms because a lot of times teacher desks are very big and it takes up quite a bit of space. But then we're communicating, this is my space and that's your space.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot of space that then gets unused. And so we said kind of early on, we need a little bit of, to put storage away or to put our bags away. But we want to create kind of a more cohesive, collaborative space.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really important. Okay, so we've talked now about the child, we've talked about the role of the teacher, we've talked about the role of the environment. Let's talk a little bit about family and community. And I'm excited for this portion because this is a part of Reggio that I am still trying to kind of figure out. I'm pretty new as far as like embracing the approach in my program, but it's a very small program. And so for me, trying to figure out how am I going to connect families, there's not always space for families to even come. They don't come into the classroom on a daily basis because of just logistics and things. So trying to figure out how to bridge that gap and involve the family, involve the community, and make it, kind of that encompassing aspect.
Yeah. So just a little like historical context for the listeners. So when I started teaching, one of the things that I was most scared of were families. I felt a tremendous amount of pressure to make sure that children were safe, to make sure that children got what they quote unquote needed. And really, I put so much as a new teacher, such an amount of pressure. And so every year I try to make one goal for the year that I'm just like, okay, I want to get better at documentation, or I want to get better at being a good communicator, or I want to get better at getting children's books that represent all the children in my classroom. And so I try to think of a goal every year. And so that goal that first year was just getting stronger with my family communication and just overall kind of lessen the pressure. Now, I've been teaching for almost 20 years. Now it's one of my favorite parts of being an educator. It is a lot for families to drop their kids off and say goodbye and pick up hours later. It takes a lot of trust, and it takes a lot of kind of honor and to do that. And so I felt like I got a better understanding when I became a mother, and had a better understanding of what that looked like. But I've always tried to, first of all, share my love for children first and foremost. If they know that I love being with children and I love what I do, and I feel lucky every day to be able to do what I do, they're going to feel that excitement. In Reggio Emilia, they think of families and communities as partner. And so they typically, the schools, they have community nights. They'll have, nights where families can come in and they can talk about what's happening in the school. And it feels a lot more organic than it does like the kind of the monthly strict PTA, or which is great that they have that and that we have that. But it feels a little bit more, they go into the classrooms and they meet, they get the children, they do, nights where they'll have, I don't know, kind of like a light atelier, and families will come with their children and be able to celebrate the work that's been happening in the classroom. And so families are crucial because we wouldn't be where we are without them, And so I really try to show a lot of respect, and I try to learn, and I try to understand, and say all the hard work that all these families are doing, and love their children well, and make sure that they know that I feel like I have the luckiest job to be able to be around these little people. And so it looks, over the years. So I said earlier, I'm a storyteller, and I feel like I'm a storyteller. And so weekly, I like to share the stories. It's looked differently over the years. Sometimes I use an app and I'll share pictures with the families. And some years I'll do a blog. Some years I'll do like a weekly kind of email with photographs. So it looks different, but families want to know, what are my children doing? What's my child doing during the day? And are they seen and celebrated for who they are? And so I try to share that. And then I also do what's called family nights. And so I've done that in the past where, we do a lot of project work throughout the year. And so then I like to have, there needs to be closure from the project work that we do. And so then I include families, and we'll have like a garden day, or, we've done a cooking project in the past, and the kids made dinner for their families. And so we had a dinner, all together. We've done an art museum before. And so there's lots of different things that you can do. But I think, at least in my opinion, I think the most important thing is that the family knows that you love their child. And so that's what I try to like send texts or messages or emails to say, here's something that Sally did today, and it just totally blew me away. I'm so proud of the growth that, and just really make it specific to that child. Yeah. So family is crucial. Community is crucial in Reggio. And then that's kind of like how I've interpreted it.
I feel like I have had a similar experience to you, especially as a very young teacher. When I first started, families were intimidating because in many cases, the parents were older than I was. And it was kind of like, who am I to tell you, And I feel like it was having my own children that totally flipped that for me. And I stayed home with my
Mhm.
children when they were young for quite a few years, actually. I was not in the classroom. And I contemplated many times over those years, when I go back to teaching, I'm going to do this differently because now that
Yep.
I'm a
Yep.
mom, I know how I would like to have received that information or that communication. And as I've kind of been working in this program that I have now, it's almost, I kind of equate it to that old traditional model with the students where it was like, I am the teacher and I'm going to give you this information. I feel like some of my relationship with the parents has been the same way. Like, here is the information in the newsletter. And then if you have questions, come to me, but there's not really much collaboration. And so, an idea that I'm going to attempt this year, we'll see how it goes, is I want to have a book club with parents.
Oh,
As I get my feedback at the end of the year, I can see, okay, here's a point where the parents maybe aren't quite getting it. I haven't communicated very well why I'm doing things this way. And so I can
mhm.
take that feedback. And I thought, I'm going to do this book club this year, and we're going to study some of those things, and we're going to have a collaborative discussion about it so that I mean, that's building a connection. It is sharing information, but in a much more collaborative way. And so for me, that is one way that I'm like, okay, that's one way I can involve parents, families, maybe not like as a whole quite as much, but at least build that connection with a parent. And it's been some trial and error trying to figure out the family and community piece for me with such a small program that I'm running
Sure.
out of my home. But the
Sure.
beautiful thing about Reggio is the flexibility there and being able to do what is going to work in my situation.
Yeah. And I think too, I think it's important for us to think about how are we communicating what's important to us with the family. So for example, play is super important to me.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I try to do is I try and get my families to play, and so sometimes they're like, "Ooh, like this is uncomfortable," but then it's like once we kind of like get into it, then you see that more. And so, I run a club called the Do Anything Club. And so it's for children, but I did a Do Anything Club for adults at our school. And so it was so
Fun.
fun to be able to offer an opportunity for the adults also to slow down and to experience some of the things that we're also saying that it's important to us. And so I think too, just thinking about, well, what do we say? And then how are we living it? Recently went to a Reggio event. Let's see, it was maybe in October of last year, and they had a picture of a bicycle. And one of the pedals is theory, and the other pedal is practice. You have to have both in order to move forward, in order to have that kind of high quality. And so I go back to this idea of like, what's my bicycle? How am I moving forward? How am I showing that theory, but then also living that out in the practice? So we're moving.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I've been really thinking about more and more.
That's a beautiful analogy. I'm going to use that. It's a visual that makes sense. And so that's a really
Yes.
a great way to think about it. Well, we're getting a little bit short on time. So I want to maybe just touch on, we've already kind of touched on some of the challenges of the Reggio approach in that there's not a lot of planning ahead of time. And so sometimes that can feel a little bit uncomfortable initially. Are there any other significant challenges? My own experience is that I haven't encountered anything super hard other than just practicing and kind of learning. Is there anything else that you can think of that a teacher who's maybe contemplating taking this approach should anticipate ahead of time?
I think one of the things that always strikes me about Reggio inspired practice and going over to Reggio and seeing and hearing from the Italians about the work is that it is not done in isolation. As an educator, they have other educators with them to think together, to offer ideas, to help capture what's happening. And I think sometimes it can be hard if you are in your own setting doing this work and you don't have anybody to talk to about it.
Yeah.
And so, that can be hard. And so one of the things that, I would encourage is so NAREA, NAREA, is an organization that connects educators from all over North America. And it's a way for people to kind of get plugged in if they would like to get plugged in. There's conferences, there's lots of things that kind of pop up from the organization. And that is one way to kind of get connected. But also, there's, some cities, there's some states that have organizations that kind of bring people together. But I think that would be a hard, like, I know some people have been like, I really want to do this work, but I'm the only person in my school. Or
Yeah.
I really want to do this work, but I'm at home with 10 kids. Or, and they've kind of shared that. Or, just see if you can find, even just going on and saying like Reggio schools in whatever the state you're in can maybe offer places that you can connect,
Yeah.
because I think there's power in beauty. As humans, we're not meant to be, or we're meant to be social. And so how are we connecting with others and kind of discerning what this work's about?
Yeah, I am a one-man show currently, and I
Yeah.
experienced the challenge of trying to bring in some of these principles in a school that was built on completely different approach, and the pushback there was hard, being the only person that was seeing
Mhm.
that. But also, I don't have pushback now because I am the only one here.
Right.
But
Right.
there's so much value in being able to bounce ideas off of somebody else and bring in their creativity. And so that is a piece that, yeah, I have to be very proactive in reaching out and making those connections because I don't have it in my own, immediate setting. So,
Right. Right. I think the other thing, on most of the journals, when I'm like, okay, what are my takeaways? Because it's just so much
yeah,
to take away when you're in Reggio, is the purpose and intention is unbelievable. And so I always am asking myself, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why don't I have this out? What purpose is it living? What's the purpose of the book that I'm reading? I really try to kind of hone in to what is the purpose really behind it all, to really kind of help ground myself and make sure that there's authentic, child-led living happening every day.
beautiful. I love that. Yeah, a lot of reflection that takes place and asking questions yourself. Well, if we have, I know that there are people out there who are very curious to try this approach and maybe, integrate some of this philosophy into their own teaching. Where would you send somebody who's maybe brand new or just has a very minimal knowledge of the Reggio approach to learn more?
Yeah, so you can look up, you can look up the Reggio Emilia schools. So if you just look up Reggio Emilia schools, you'll pop up with lots of emails. Naria is another one. And then I would love to talk with people personally.
Yeah.
I love talking about, what this is and what it looks like. And so I have my own website called woventhreadconsulting.com. And while I am not a Reggio expert, and I wouldn't say that I'm a Reggio expert, but I'm passionate about thinking about it, and I'm passionate about what it looks like in our context. And so, I would love to talk with people. So if anybody's interested, you're more than welcome to email, and I, would love to do that. I'm also planning on doing a book study countrywide, starting in January. And so if you want to kind of get plugged in and talk about these ideas with other people, you can always send me an email and I can get you on the list.
Awesome. It's always nice. There's so much we can learn on our own, but to kind of have that hand to hold you in those initial stages is really can be super duper helpful. So that's where your consulting can come and, be a real big benefit to people. So I will be sure to
Yeah,
put
for sure.
your information in the show notes so that people know how to reach out and find you. And I just want to say thank you again for sharing your expertise. You say you're not an expert, but you know a whole lot about Reggio, and you've had some really great experiences implementing that and, troubleshooting and learning how to really make it work and be beneficial for everybody. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate you just taking some time to talk with me and invite me on here, because I could talk for hours. And so this is nice to be guided through some, with some questions and just share my passions.
Awesome. Well, we'll see what the feedback is, but maybe we'll have to bring you back for the advanced course on Reggio later on as people kind of dip their feet in and see how it goes for them. So we'll maybe chat again later.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening. Remember to hit that subscribe button to continue learning how to bring more play into your classroom. Plus, get more tips on Instagram at play_before_pencils or at playbeforepencils.com.